Today, I'm going to discuss Chapter 2 of No Man Knows My History. Last week, I talked about Chapter 1 of No Man Knows My History. Today, I'm going to dive into Chapter 2. This chapter has so much in it, and there are two very big topics that are really important to cover really thoroughly if you're trying to figure out what the real story is behind what Fawn Brodie says in her book. So I'm going to break this up into two videos. Today, we're going to explore the treasure digging aspect of the chapter. Next week, I will talk about the first vision. There are so many things about Joseph Smith being a treasure digger that need to be examined. But you might ask yourself, why does it even matter? Who cares if he was a treasure digger? First, I want to address Joseph Smith's reputation. In the LDS Church today, Joseph Smith is revered. His picture is in all of the churches. In church, we sing a hymn called Praise to the Man, where we sing about how he talked to Jesus and Jesus appointed him prophet and seer. It speaks of how he died as a martyr, and honored and blessed be that ever great name. That's a line from it. It also calls him a hero. These are all things that we still believe about Joseph Smith in the LDS Church. And you have to. You have to be able to believe that, because if you take Joseph Smith down, you take the whole church down. On page 16, Fawn Brodie talks about what his reputation seems to be at his time. She says, "The evidence, however, leaves no doubt that whatever Joseph's inner feelings, his reputation before he organized his church was not that of an adolescent mystic brooding over visions, but of a likable ne'er-do-well who was notorious for tall tales and necromantic arts, and who spent his leisure leading a band of idlers in digging for buried treasure." But on the next page, she's also fair in saying that he was gregarious and cheerful, he was imaginative, he was born to leadership, but hampered by meager education and grinding poverty. And this is kind of a response to a few sentences before that, where she brings up an affidavit that 51 of his neighbors signed. And in the appendix of the book, she has a copy of the affidavit. It reads like this: "We, the undersigned, have been acquainted with the Smith family for a number of years, while they resided near this place, and we have no hesitation in saying that we consider them destitute of that moral character which ought to entitle them to the confidence of any community. They were particularly famous for visionary projects, spent much of their time in digging for money, which they pretended was hid in the earth, and to this day large excavations may be seen in the earth not far from their residence, where they used to spend their time in digging for hidden treasures. Joseph Smith Sr. and his son Joseph were in particular considered entirely destitute of moral character and addicted to vicious habits." Again, that was signed by 51 of the neighbors. You could easily argue that all those 51 people have a vendetta against the Smiths, but why would that many people have a personal vendetta against them? Just because they don't like his religion. It's possible, but it's really hard to find it probable. And from her other quote about Joseph, a lot of people had this opinion of them, of the Smith family in general and Joseph, but also did say that he was likable, that he was friendly, that he had a good nature. I don't think most people saw all bad. On page 26, she writes, "Daniel Hendricks, who helped set type for the Book of Mormon, once wrote that Joseph had a jovial, easy, don't-care way about him that made him a lot of warm friends. He was a good talker and would have made a fine stump speaker if he had the training. He was known among the young men I associated with as a romancer of the first water. I never knew so ignorant a man as Joe was to have such a fertile imagination. He could never tell a common occurrence in his daily life without embellishing the story with his imagination. Yet I remember that he was grieved one day when old Parson Reed told Joe that he was going to hell for his lying habits." So again, that kind of supports the idea that he was likable, he had friends, he was warm, but enough people were still willing to sign that affidavit about their reputation later. She also tells us in this chapter about sworn testimonies were published in 1834 by Eber D. Howe in a book called Mormonism Unveiled. Fawn Brodie does point out here he might have chosen some of the worst ones because of his bias against the Smith family, and that is completely possible, but that doesn't mean that they are incorrect or that they are untruthful either. I found that when you bring up things like this, a lot of people's argument to Fawn Brodie with this kind of information in the book is that you can't prove it. You can't prove that he did everything that these people talk about. You can't prove that everything they say is true because it's just somebody's reminiscence of him. However, the LDS Church is very quick to use any reminiscence in the same way if it is a positive one. So if any of these people say anything positive about Joseph Smith, they would use it in an instant on their website without having to have any credibility for it at all. But when it's negative, then people say, well, you can't prove that, where are your sources, things like that. And I find that to be a biased way to look at it as well. I think that it is good to look at all of these sources, read what they have to say, see if there's anything that kind of agrees among them all, and then get your ideas from that. So why would the sources that only have positive things to say, when we know a lot of the facts, which we'll go into in a minute, why would only the positive ones count? Some of these affidavits are also in the appendix of the book. I'm not going to read all of them, but there are a few that I want to read parts of now, and a few that I'm going to get into in a little while. The first one shows an article that Obadiah Dogberry published in the Palmyra Reflector. And he here says that Joseph had a propensity to superstition and a fondness for everything marvelous. He evinced a firm belief in the existence of hidden treasures, and that this section of country abounded in them. He also revived, or in other words, propagated the vulgar yet popular belief that these treasures were held in charge by some evil spirit, which was supposed to be either the devil himself or some one of his trusty favorites. At a time when the money-digging ardor was somewhat abated, the elder Smith declared that his son Joe had seen the spirit, which he then described as a little old man with a long beard, and we're going to talk about that more in another video, and was informed that he, Joe, under certain circumstances, eventually should obtain great treasure, and that in due time he, the spirit, would furnish him, Joe, with a book, which would give an account of the ancient inhabitants of this country. So I wanted to get to some of the affidavits. One of the affidavits is from Willard Chase, and he said that he became acquainted with the Smith family in about the year 1820. At that time, they were engaged in the money-digging business. I employed Alvin and Joseph Smith to assist me, the latter of whom is now known as the Mormon Prophet. After digging about 20 feet below the surface of the earth, we discovered a singularly appearing stone, which excited my curiosity. I brought it to the top of the well, and as we were examining it, Joseph put it into his hat, and then his face into the top of the hat. After obtaining the stone, he began to publish abroad what wonders he would discover by looking into it. The Mormon historian B.H. Roberts, he collaborated with this. He said, yes, he did find that stone in the well of Willard Chase. And in fact, he made it sound like he was going to be borrowing it, but never gave it back. He then goes on to talk about the vision of an angel, which Joseph Smith said was Moroni, that would tell him where to find the Book of Mormon plates and how he went to find them. So we'll get into that a little bit later in a different video. We then have a report from Abigail Harris, who says that she made a visit to Martin Harris and was joined in the company of Joseph Smith Sr. and his wife. They said that the plates he then had in possession were an introduction to the Gold Bible, that all of them upon which the Bible was written were so heavy it would take 4 stout men to load them into the cart. That Joseph had also discovered by looking through his stone the vessel in which the gold was melted from which the plates were made, and the machine in which they were rolled. He also discovered in the bottom of the vessel 3 balls of gold, each as large as his fist. The old lady said that after the book was translated, the plates were to be publicly exhibited, admittance 25 cents. She calculated it would bring in annually an enormous sum of money. In the 2nd month following, Martin Harris and his wife were at my house. In a conversation, she told me she wished her husband would quit them, as she believed it was all false and delusion. Mr. Harris's reply was, "What if it is a lie? If you will let me alone, I will make money of it." There's also an affidavit from Lucy Harris saying that Martin Harris became more cross and turbulent and abusive to her after becoming involved with the Smiths. The last one I'm going to read from right now is from Joseph Capron, who says, I, Joseph Capron, became acquainted with Joseph Smith Sr. in the year of our Lord 1827. They have since then been really a peculiar people, fond of the foolish and marvelous, at one time addicted to vice and grossest immoralities, at another time making the highest pretensions to piety and holy intercourse with Almighty God. The family of Smiths held Joseph Jr. in high estimation on account of some supernatural power which he was supposed to possess. This power he pretended to have received through the medium of a stone of peculiar quality. The stone was placed in a hat in such a manner as to exclude all light except that which emanated from the stone itself. The light of the stone, he pretended, enabled him to see anything he wished. Accordingly, he discovered ghosts, infernal spirits, mountains of gold and silver, and many other invaluable treasures deposited in the earth. He would often tell his neighbors of his wondrous discoveries and urge them to embark in the money-digging business. The sapient Joseph discovered northwest of my house a chest of gold watches, but as they were in possession of the evil spirit, it required skill and stratagem to obtain them. Accordingly, orders were given to stick a parcel of large stakes in the ground, several rods around in a circular form. This was to be done directly over the spot where the treasures were deposited. A messenger was then sent to Palmyra to procure a polished sword, after which Samuel F. Lawrence, with a drawn sword in his hand, marched around to guard any assault which his satanic majesty might be disposed to make. Meantime, the rest of the company were busily employed in digging for the watches. They worked as usual till quite exhausted, but in spite of their brave defender, Lawrence, and their bulwarks of stakes, the devil came off victorious and carried away the watches. At length, Joseph pretended to find the gold plates. The scheme, he believed, would relieve the family from all pecuniary embarrassment. His father told me that when the book was published, they would be enabled from the profits of the work to carry into successful operation the money-digging business. He gave me no intimation at that time that the book was to be of a religious character or that it had anything to do with revelation. He declared it to be a speculation and said when it was completed, my family will be placed on a level above the generality of mankind. Again, we don't know exactly what things that they said were true and weren't true, if it all is, if there's some of it is. But the one thing I found interesting when reading all the affidavits, those and the other ones I'll read in a minute, is that many of them mentioned putting the rock in the hat and putting his head in the hat to find things. And that is something that we'll talk about again in a minute, but it is something that we know he did to translate the Book of Mormon. And that was denied or not talked about for a very long time. And so most people in the church didn't know it existed. So the fact that all these people were saying that means that they were telling the truth about something he was doing that people could have used as a falsehood for a long time. Joseph also responded to these affidavits to this book, Mormonism Unveiled, when it came out. She has this response on page 17, where he says, Joseph himself, at the age of 10, my father's family removed to Palmyra, New York, where and in the vicinity of which I lived or made it my place of residence until I was 21, the latter part in the town of Manchester. During this time, as it is common to most or all youths, I fell into many vices and follies, but as my accusers are and have been forward to accuse me of being guilty of gross and outrageous violations of the peace and good order of the community, I take the occasion to remark that though, as I have said above, as is common to most or all youths, I fell into many vices and follies, I have not, neither can it be sustained in truth, been guilty of wronging or injuring any man or society of men. And those imperfections to which I allude, and for which I have often had occasion to lament, were a light and too often vain mind exhibiting a foolish and trifling conversation. And that was published in the Latter-day Saints Messenger and Advocate, Volume 1 in Kirtland, Ohio. This is something I think is important, because if somebody said those things about me that were not true, and we will go into some worse things that people said in some of the affidavits in a few minutes, and I want you to remember this, he did not deny the allegations that were brought upon him. And if somebody had said things specifically that I did that were egregious, I would make sure that I was detailing them and saying specifically which things I had not done. And he didn't do that. On the LDS website, under the treasure seeking gospel topic, it says, Joseph Smith's critics often tried to disparage him by calling him a money digger or a treasure seeker. But is it disparaging to tell the truth? Then they try to normalize the things that are in this chapter by saying, like many of the people around them, they accepted these familiar folk practices. Was treasure digging normal? Was folk magic, which we'll be going into in a minute, was that normal in this time period and in this place? On page 18, Fawn Brodie does say that yes, it was pretty normal. She said New England was full of treasure hunters, at least 500 respectable men who do in the simplicity and sincerity of their hearts believe that immense treasures lie concealed upon our green mountains, many of whom have been for a number of years industriously and perseveringly engaged in digging it up, which is reprinted from the Wayne Sentinel in Palmyra, New York. So she does mention that it was a common thing. However, it was earlier as well. Benjamin Franklin, almost 100 years before Joseph Smith, is quoted as saying this: There are among us great numbers of honest artificers and laboring people who, fed with a vain hope of growing suddenly rich, neglect their business, almost to the ruining of themselves and families, and voluntarily endure abundance of fatigue in a grutless search after imaginary hidden treasure. At length a mighty hole is dug, and perhaps several cartloads of earth thrown out, but alas, no keg or iron pot is found, no seaman's chest crammed with Spanish pistols or weighty pieces of eight. Then they conclude that through some mistake in the procedure, some rash word spoke, or some rule of art neglected, the guardian spirit had power to sink it deeper into the earth and convey it out of their reach. And that's from the papers of Benjamin Franklin. So, and Ronald Walker is quoted as saying, while finding the right moment to dig was important, the need to circumvent the treasure guardian was crucial. The American treasure keeper might be demonic or divine, or it could be a cat, dog, snake, or some other protecting animal. But generally, the American treasure guardian was a murdered youth or man whose body had been left with the buried valuables to ensure their protection. Guardian Indians were a frequent motive, while a murdered pirate protected Captain Kidd's troves. I have a Captain Kidd book that I got because of my LDS studies, because there is a lot of proof, a lot of evidence, that Joseph Smith loved the Captain Kidd stories, the books. Captain Kidd was a real pirate back then, and they believed that he had buried some of his treasure in that area. The reason I find this important, and I will probably go into it in another video, that some of the names from the Book of Mormon come from Captain Kidd stories, including Cumorah and Moroni, which are names that will come up later in our videos. And if you're already LDS or ex-LDS, you'll know what those names are. So yes, it was normal for a lot of people for a long time. But the fact that it was normal also showed people how dangerous it was, how many people were being swindled. So it was illegal. The LDS Church does this a lot in their Gospel Topics and Gospel Topics essays and their Saints book and all of their histories, or in talks that they give. They will very often say things like everybody else at the time, or just like so many of their peers. And they're trying to normalize what they're doing by saying, well, it was normal back then, so it's fine. And sometimes I want to stop and think about that, of like, what is illegal nowadays that a lot of people do? And just because a lot of people are doing it doesn't make it okay. And it doesn't. And so you have to really notice when they put that into something so that you can really think about it for a second of like, okay, well, wait, but just because other people in the area were doing it, does that mean that we don't have to look at it any closer? Now this brings us to the next part of the story. On page 19, Fawn Brodie talks about Walter the magician. She says that the excitement over the possibilities of Indian treasure and perhaps buried Spanish gold had reached its height in Palmyra with the coming of what the editor of the Palmyra Reflector called a vagabond fortune teller named Walters. He was often called Walters the Magician in many of the sources that you find about him. He so won the confidence of several farmers that for some months they paid him $3 a day to hunt for buried money on their property. In addition to crystals, stuffed toads, and mineral rods, the scryer's usual paraphernalia, Walters claimed to have found an ancient Indian record that described the locations of their hidden treasure. This he would read aloud to his followers in what seemed to be a strange and exotic tongue, but was actually, the newspaper editor declared, an old Latin version of Cicero's orations. The press accounts describing Walter's activity, published in 1830 to 1831, stated significantly that when he left the neighborhood, his mantle fell upon young Joseph Smith. So there are many accounts of people putting Joseph Smith with Walters the magician. It mentions magical items with him. This chapter was huge to me when I first read this book, because when I saw that there were allegations of the Smith family being involved in the occult and folk magic, I couldn't believe it at first. And it really bothered me, and we'll go into that more later. But how do we know if they really were? So we're going to talk about the seer stone first. On page 20, she writes, Joseph's money digging began in earnest with his discovery of a seer stone. This is the official picture posted on the official LDS website of this seer stone. Although sources say that Joseph Smith had many, and that most of the members of the church back then ended up having seer stones of their own. On the LDS website, it compares Joseph Smith's use of a seer stone to the rod of Aaron, the brass serpent, the Ark of the Covenant, and even to Jesus healing the blind man with spittle mixed with mud. I personally find this very offensive that they compared Jesus healing someone to Joseph Smith looking into a rock in a hat to find buried treasure. But it's offensive also for it to be compared to the other items in the Bible. Were any of those ancient Bible items used to find treasure or wealth? We now know that this stone was the instrument used to translate the Book of Mormon. This is a fact that the church did not admit until recently. The only pictures we ever saw of Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon showed him at a table with the gold plates out in front of him, translating it in the traditional way. But many of the contemporary sources of his time did say that he put a rock in the hat, put his head in the hat, and the words would appear on the stone. There are many statements from the beginning of church history that talk about him putting the stone in the hat to translate the Book of Mormon. This is something the LDS Church knew for a long time. Why did they show us the wrong pictures? There are also many contemporary sources from Joseph Smith's time that show that he used that rock in the hat to find treasure. Martin Harris said, and they took Joseph to look in the stone for them, and he did for a while, and then he told them the enchantment was so strong he could not see, and they gave up. The affidavits that we read earlier mentioned the rock in the hat for treasure digging. We know that he was paid to put his rock in the hat and look into it to find treasure. We know he never found any. And we know that he used the same technique to translate the Book of Mormon. There are also multiple church sources of his time saying that he put the rock in the hat to find the golden plates themselves, which is not what you are taught in church. That contradicts the story of the angel Moroni telling him where the plates were. But we'll touch on that later. Is there any other proof of any other occult folk magic-like item besides the seer stone? Yes. In this picture, the larger two circles are Joseph Smith's Jupiter talisman. The smaller pictures show the comparison with the Jupiter talisman found in Francis Barrett's book, The Magus. This is from the book Mormonism, Magic, and Masonry by Sandra and Gerald Tanner. In 1974, Dr. Reed Durham, who was director of the LDS Institute of Religion at the University of Utah and president of the Mormon History Association, made a discovery that was so startling it caused great consternation among Mormon scholars and officials. Dr. Durham found that what had previously been identified as the Masonic jewel of the prophet Joseph Smith was in reality a Jupiter talisman. This is a medallion which contains material relating to astrology and magic. Dr. Durham, apparently not realizing the devastating implications of its discovery, announced the important find in his presidential address before the Mormon History Association on April 20th, 1974. He said this: "I should like to initiate all of you into what is perhaps the strangest and most mysterious occult-like, esoteric, and yet Masonically oriented practice ever adopted by Joseph Smith. All available evidence suggested that Joseph Smith, the prophet, possessed a magical Masonic medallion or talisman, which he worked during his lifetime and which was evidently on his person when he was martyred." He goes on to talk about the size of it. It was about a silver dollar, what it was made of. And then he said that it was fully notarized by the family to be authentic and to have belonged to Joseph Smith. It carries the sign and image of Jupiter and should more appropriately be referred to as the Table of Jupiter. And in some very real and quite mysterious sense, this particular Table of Jupiter was the most appropriate talisman for Joseph Smith. Indeed, it seemed meant for him because on all levels of interpretation, planetary, mythological, numerological, astrological, and talismanic magic, the prophet was in every case appropriately described. In a magic book printed in England in 1801, published in America in 1804, I traced it to Manchester and to New York. It was a magic book by Francis Barrett. And lo and behold, how thrilled I was when I saw in his list of magic seals the very talisman which Joseph Smith had in his possession at the time of his martyrdom. Typically, a person born under Jupiter will have the dignity of a natural ruler. He will probably have an impressive manner. In physical appearance, the highly developed Jupiterian is strong, personable, and often handsome. The Jupiterian influence produces a cheerful, winning personality capable of great development. Another interesting fact for people that know a little bit about LDS theology and scripture, to the Egyptians, Jupiter was known as Ammon. And Ammon is a name that comes up in the Book of Mormon. When I first read this quote and found this quote, I was surprised. I thought if he knew about this connection to Joseph Smith, and that he died with this Jupiter talisman in his pocket. Well, it was in a little pouch that he wore. Why is this something I've never heard before? In the book Mormonism, Shadow or Reality by Sandra and Gerald Tanner, they tell this story that because of his frank method of dealing with these matters, he was severely criticized by Mormon scholars and officials. He was even called in by Mormon President Spencer W. Kimball and finally found it necessary to issue a letter in which he reaffirmed his faith in Joseph Smith and said that he was sorry for the concerns and misunderstandings his speech has caused. He didn't tell anything that wasn't true. He still believed in Joseph Smith, apparently, but he had to apologize for the concerns that it brought up. Almost every major vision and event in Joseph Smith's life aligned with the astrological timing of Jupiter and the moon. We know exactly when Moroni was supposed to have visited him to tell him about the golden plates and his visits to get the plates. And they all fell on a date that was important with this. I find it funny though, we'll get into this in the next video, but it's funny that we know the exact date that Moroni came to Joseph Smith and when he went yearly to try to get the plates. But we don't have the exact date for the first vision that we'll talk about in the next video. In the Smith family descendants, they also have other magical items that have been handed down. There is a dagger with Masonic symbols on the edge. They call it the Mars dagger. There are many parchments that have magical figures on them and different signs. One of them has the Jupiter sign again. They have the pentagram type stars. They have all sorts of Masonic symbols. One of them says holiness to the Lord all around it, so it's called the holiness to the Lord parchment, and that phrase would later go on the temple. They also had the special pouches to carry these things in, which were called lamens, which is also a name that comes up in the Book of Mormon. Eldred G. Smith, a former patriarch emeritus of the church. Emeritus means they release them from the calling, but they still get the notoriety that comes with it. He had possession of these items and said that they were definitely from Hiram, his great-great-grandfather, and admits that they may be Kabbalistic in origin. Kabbalistic, if I'm saying that right, means occultic and mystic. If the Smith family had all of these items and used them, they obviously believed in their power. Fayette Lapham, who visited the family in 1830, said, "This Joseph Smith Sr., we soon learned from his own lips, was a firm believer in witchcraft and other supernatural things, and had brought up his family in the same belief." Joshua Stafford said, "They told marvelous stories about ghosts, hobgoblins, caverns, and various other mysterious matters." In one of the affidavits, he talked about a circle made of sticks over the places of the treasure. Usually, treasure digging would also include animal sacrifices. If you go back and you read about people that did treasure digging besides Joseph Smith, you will see that. They did this animal sacrifice to appease the guardian spirits of the treasure. So did the Smith family practice animal sacrifice? I'm going to go back now to the affidavits at the back of the book. This one is from William Stafford. "I first became acquainted with Joseph Sr. and his family in the year 1820. They lived at the time in Palmyra, about 1.5 miles from my residence. A great part of their time was devoted to digging for money, especially in the nighttime when they said money could most easily be obtained." So he goes on to talk about the different places they went, the different hills around the house. And then he says, "Joseph Jr. could see by placing a stone of singular appearance in his hat in such a manner as to exclude all light, at which time they pretended he could see all things within and under the earth, that he could see within the above-mentioned caves large gold bars and silver plates, that he could also discover the spirits in whose charge these treasures were clothed in ancient dress. Old Joseph and one of the boys came to me one day and said that Joseph Jr. had discovered some very remarkable and valuable treasures which could be procured only in one way. That way was as follows: that a black sheep should be taken onto the ground where the treasures were concealed. After cutting its throat, it should be led around in a circle while bleeding. This being done, the wrath of the evil spirit would be appeased, the treasures could then be obtained, and my share of them was to be fourfold. To gratify my curiosity, I let them have a large fat sheep. They afterwards informed me the sheep was killed pursuant to the commandment, but as there was some mistake in the process, it did not have the desired effect." Hyle Lewis, a cousin of Emma Smith, said that Joseph Smith sacrificed dogs during his treasure digs. He said, "The facts are that the sacrifice of white dogs, black sluts, which I believe means female dogs, black cats, and such like was an indispensable part of or appendage of the art which Smith, the embryo prophet, was then practicing." He goes on to say, "Smith translated the Book of Mormon by means of the same peepstone and under the same inspiration that directed his enchantments and dog sacrifices. It was all by the same spirit." And that's from Early Mormon Documents by Dan Vogel. Emily Austin, a convert in 1830, recalled, "For in the time of their digging for money and not finding it attainable, Joe Smith told them there was a charm on the pots of money, and if some animal was killed and the blood sprinkled around the place, then they could get at it. So they killed a dog and tried this method of obtaining the precious metal. But again, money was scarce in those diggings. Still they dug and dug, but never came to the precious treasure." And that is from the book Life Among the Mormons from Emily Austin. So even if they did dig for treasures with the seer stone, even if they did animal sacrifice, there are a lot of people that say that these things stopped right away as soon as the church was formed. James Collins Brewster told the story of how Joseph Smith Sr. and some other high church leaders visited them in their home and told them that they knew where some money was in the earth in New York and that it was their duty to help them obtain it, and if they didn't, the curse of God would be upon them. They told them that they had consecrated their mineral rods and their seer stones with consecrated oil in the temple, and that they were praying over them in the temple so that the devil wouldn't deceive them. So they believed them. But when they went to obtain the treasure, they didn't find any. There's also the case of the Salem, Massachusetts treasure. Joseph Smith received a revelation that is now in the Doctrine and Covenants of the Church in section 111. And even here it says, "Revelation given through Joseph Smith, the prophet at Salem, Massachusetts. At this time, the leaders of the church were heavily in debt due to their labors in the ministry. Hearing that a large amount of money would be available to them in Salem, the prophet, Sidney Rigdon, Hiram Smith, and Oliver Cowdery traveled there from Kirtland, Ohio to investigate this claim. And in this revelation it says, 'I, the Lord your God, am not displeased with your coming this journey, notwithstanding your follies. I have much treasure in this city for you, for the benefit of Zion.'" The LDS website itself says that they spent many weeks in Salem, hoping to obtain the money to get the church out of debt and redeem Zion. Of course, they didn't find anything. The church website now states, "What the Lord accomplished through their trip to Salem remains unknown." There are quotes from Lucy Mack Smith, the mother of Joseph Smith, that state that she doesn't want people to assume that all their family did was draw magic circles, do soothsaying, and the faculty of abrek, and neglect their other business. She seemed to be wanting people to know that that's not all they did. But what is the faculty of abrac? I don't even know if I'm pronouncing that right, but I looked it up. It is from abracadabra and is a magic work or formula used on amulets to work magic charms. What about the animal sacrifices? Surely those stopped after he started the church, if they ever did them. Joseph Smith later wrote in his History of the Church, Volume 4, "These sacrifices, as well as every ordinance belonging to the priesthood, will, when the temple of the Lord shall be built, and the sons of Levi be purified, be fully restored, and attended to in all their powers, ramifications, and blessings." And Wandel Mace, a devout Mormon, recorded in his journal, which is in the microfilm at BYU, Joseph told them to go to Kirtland and cleanse and purify a certain room in the temple, that they must kill a lamb and offer a sacrifice unto the Lord, which should prepare them to ordain Willard Richards a member of the quorum of the 12 apostles. I found that extremely disturbing. As for the other things, Anthony H. Lund's journal says that Brigham Young used the divining rod that was passed down to him from Oliver Cowdery, who got it from Joseph Smith, and that is how he found where the Salt Lake Temple should be built. Let's talk about magic for a minute. Why did this bother me so much? Aside from the obvious with the animal sacrifice. I'm sitting right here in front of Harry Potter. I like Harry Potter. I've got a little ghost up there. I've got a few Halloween decorations around my house. I celebrate Halloween to a small extent, and I read spooky books. Over the past few years, I've become a little bit more selective of what I take in that has magic and spookiness in it. I have found that when I'm watching something or reading something that has witches or ghosts or anything with a spooky element, that there are times when it feels just like imagination. It feels like make-believe, like the fantasies we read, like the White Witch in Narnia, like the magic in Lord of the Rings. And then there's other times when it feels evil. There are times when I've read something or watched something and had to stop right away or turn it off because I feel evil within the pages or on the screen. And that is where I've drawn my line. I've drawn my line of, is it crossing a line of what feels like make-believe and just silly fun to something that is serious, something that is believed in. Your line might be different than mine. You might do zero Halloween. Your line might be more than mine. You might be okay with more spookiness and movies that I wouldn't watch or books I wouldn't read. We all have that different conviction. But when I was in 3rd grade, I remember distinctly one day going to school with my friend, and all of the teachers were standing in a line at the fence where we would go into the playground. I found out that somebody had gone on the school grounds and drawn a big pentagram and had sacrificed animals on it. Now, I don't remember if it was one animal sacrificed on it or if it was at each point of the star, which is how I remember it, but I don't think I saw it. So I don't know for sure which one of those it is. That really stuck with me. I have always loved animals, and especially as a child. And I was so freaked out by that. So anything with pentagrams and animal sacrifice has always been something that is immediate no for me. I don't like this. This doesn't make me feel good. I've seen people who actually believe in this and who do it, and I'm not okay with it. I try very hard to stay away from things that leave the realm of fantasy and go into the realm of the occult. And that is how all of this felt for me when I was learning it the first time. When I saw that there were pentagrams on the temple that I was married in, I was bothered by it. I believe that most of it is Masonic in origin, but it still made me feel the way I felt the day I found out that there was a pentagram on my school grounds. All right, moving on from that yuckiness. On page 20, Fawn Brodie says, in later years, Joseph frankly admitted in his church newspaper and also in his journal that he had been a money digger, although he wrote that it was not particularly profitable as he got only $14 a month for it. And this is true. There are parts in church records where they show him denying ever being a treasure digger. But then you can also find this admittance in the essays and in other areas where he says, well, I only got $14 a month for it, so I wasn't really serious at it. But when you realize that a farm worker at the time, which is what he should have been doing, what we always believed he did, would only have been making $9 a month in Vermont, you realize that he made so much more at money digging than he ever did at farm labor. The next part of this chapter that I found very interesting is when she talks about the court case. On pages 28 and 29, she brings up this case in court. His mother wrote that Josiah Stoll came all the way from Pennsylvania to see her son on account of having heard that he possessed certain keys by which he could discern things invisible to the natural eye. Stow was so impressed that he begged the youth to go south with him and look for a lost silver mine said to have been worked by the Spaniards in the Susquehanna Valley. He would pay him, he said, $14 a month and board him for free. In the appendix of the book, she has written the court case notes. She says that the trial was held before a justice of the peace in Bainbridge, Chenango County, New York, March 20th, 1826. I'm not going to read through the whole court case notes, but in it talks about how he was charged as a disorderly person and imposter, that they had witnesses that were for him and against him talking about what he did and how he would tell them where the treasure was. They would go and they would do the dig. Something inevitably went wrong and the treasure would be slippery and go down into the earth so they couldn't get it. They talked about how he would look in the hat with the stone. They talk about all of the things that are mentioned in all the affidavits. At the end of the notes, it says, and thereupon the court finds the defendant guilty. When I looked into that to find out more and find out if it was accurate, I found that most of the notes and information about it said that the judge said that since he was so young, let him off basically with a warning, but he was pronounced guilty. He just wasn't charged with any further jail time because he had been arrested. He didn't just show up at the court. He was arrested, then taken to court, and he was released after being found guilty. After her book came out, LDS leaders immediately declared this record in her book to be a forgery. In the Deseret News, they printed, "This alleged find is no discovery at all, for the purported record has been included in other books. After all her puffing and promise, the author produces no court record at all, though persistently calling it such. This alleged record is obviously spurious. It could not possibly have been made at the time as the case proceeded. It is patently a fabrication." The Mormon apostle John Whitstow stated, "This alleged court record seems to be a literary attempt of an enemy to ridicule Joseph Smith by bringing together all of the current gossip of that day and making him appear to confess to it. There is no existing proof that such a trial was ever held." Sandra and Gerald Tanner, who I've mentioned previously in this video, announced in the Salt Lake City Messenger in 1971 that a very important document had been found. Wesley P. Walters found the court document in Norwich, New York. He found Justice Albert Neely's bill showing the costs involved in several trials in 1826, and the fifth item is Joseph Smith, the glass looker. It also has the additional evidence of it taking place on March 20th, 1826, which is the date on the published court record in her book, and the fee for the trial for $2.68, which is exactly the record. It is impossible to continue to deny the authenticity of the court record, and you can now find them on the Joseph Smith papers put out by the church. Along with it is a bill for trial, which you can also find in the Joseph Smith papers now. The Joseph Smith papers has these records where you can see them, but how do they treat this on other areas of their website? Because a lot of people might not be looking at the Joseph Smith papers. In the Gospel Topics area, it says, someone in the community, possibly an extended family member of Stoll, accused Joseph Smith of gazing into a stone to discover lost property, and as a result, Joseph was ordered to appear before the Justice of the Peace, Albert Neely, likely on charges of disorderly conduct. This is interesting to stop and think about because they know who did it and they know what the charge was based on the things they have in the Joseph Smith papers, but they still make it sound like they don't know who did it or what he was being charged for. His arrest appears to have been based on a statute in New York state law outlawing pretending to discover where lost goods may be found. 4 accounts describe this hearing, all of which suggest Joseph suffered no serious legal consequences in its aftermath. Other details vary and sometimes contradict each other, which you'll find, yes, their sources contradict each other. The Joseph Smith papers have the accurate notes and pictures. This says they don't know who did it, what he was being accused of for sure, and there were no serious legal consequences, which are true. He didn't get any huge consequences, but he was pronounced guilty. It goes on to say the outcome of the hearing remains a puzzle. A purported court record indicates the judge found Joseph guilty. They say purported. A neighbor of Josiah Stowell claimed the court condemned Joseph but allowed him to escape on account of his youth. In their Saints book, they point out that it was Josiah Stowell's nephew, showing that they do know who did it, and they claim that there was no evidence and that the judge dismissed the charge. The average LDS member is going to read the Saints books for their history. If that is the only thing they read, they will hear that the charge was dismissed. They won't know that he was found guilty before they let him go. So depending on which part of the church website you go to, which of their sources you read, you'll get a different story. Why wouldn't they just be honest about this? Now, especially that they have all of the proof on the Joseph Smith papers where anyone can see it if they want to. I would imagine that it's because of quotes like this. Unibly, the man that wrote No Ma'am, That's Not History, in response to this book by Fawn Brodie, wrote in his book, The Myth Makers, if this court record is authentic, it is the most damning evidence in existence against Joseph Smith and would be the most devastating blow to Smith ever delivered. Mormon scholar Francis W. Kirkham said that if the court record could be proven authentic, it would show that Mormonism itself is untrue. A careful study of all facts regarding this alleged confession of Joseph Smith in a court of law that he had ever used a seer stone to find hidden treasure for purposes of fraud must come to the conclusion that no such record was ever made and therefore is not in existence. If any evidence had been in existence that Joseph Smith had used a seer stone for fraud and deception, and especially had he made this confession in a court of law as early as 1826, or 4 years before the Book of Mormon was printed, and this confession was in the court record, it would have been impossible for him to have organized the restored church. He goes on to say that if such a court confession could be identified and proved, then it follows that his believers must deny his claimed divine guidance, which then led them to follow him. How could he be a prophet of God, the leader of the restored church to these tens of thousands, if he had been the superstitious fraud which the pages from a book declare him to be? You can see why, even though they have them now, and they have them on the Joseph Smith papers for anyone who does want to see if they're willing to admit about it, they wouldn't want to advertise this to everyone in the Saints' books. Page 21 to 33, Fawn Brodie tells us the story of how Joseph Smith met his wife and how her father did not approve of him, and so they eloped. They would then go back later to pick up her items that she left behind. This brings us to what I think are some important affidavits in the back of the book. For Peter Ingersoll, he says that he tells how he became acquainted with Joseph Smith and that the general employment of the family was digging for money. He then said, Joseph Sr. told me that the best time for digging money was in the heat of summer when the heat of the sun caused the chests of money to rise near the top of the ground. He then goes on to say how Joseph Smith hired him to go with Joseph and Emma back to her father's house to get her furniture and items she had left behind. When we arrived at Mr. Hale's in Harmony, Pennsylvania, from which place he had taken his wife, a scene presented itself truly affecting. His father-in-law, Mr. Hale, addressed Joseph in a flood of tears. You have stolen my daughter and married her. I had much rather have followed her to the grave. You spend your time in digging for money, pretend to see in a stone, and thus try to deceive people. Joseph wept and acknowledged that he could not see in a stone now nor ever could, and that his former pretensions in that respect were all false. He then promised to give up his old habits of digging for money and looking into stones. Mr. Hale told Joseph if he would move to Pennsylvania and work for a living, he would assist him in getting into business. Joseph acceded to this proposition. I then returned with Joseph and his wife to Manchester. Her father, Isaac Hale, also provided an affidavit in this book, and it tells the exact same story. So why does any of this matter? Why do I think that's such an important part of the book? I think it is important that people know that his family practiced folk magic. I think it's very important that they know about the seer stone and how he was using it. He would take that seer stone and use it to translate the plates that would become the Book of Mormon. All of this would also end up in the Book of Mormon. There are multiple stories in the Book of Mormon that talk about slippery treasure, which is what they called it when they couldn't do something exactly right and find the treasure that he was telling them would be there. That idea has also gone over into things that happen in the LDS Church. When on Sundays, when they do the sacrament, which is when they give the bread and water to everybody in the congregation, young boys get up and say the prayers. If they don't have the prayer word for word exactly perfect, they have to keep doing it over and over again until they do. That's just like the incantations in money digging, in folk magic. Even when somebody gets baptized, it's by immersion, but if there is a hair above the water, they have to do it again. So these principles that he used in his money digging and in his folk magic have bled over into the LDS Church. When you start realizing how much folk magic and astrology they had involved in the creating of this church, then you start seeing it everywhere. And that is why I find it very important. And I've already told you my personal experiences with occult and magic situations that really made me convicted on the fact that anyone who's doing magic circles and pentagrams and animal sacrifice, I don't believe it has any place anywhere near religion. So let me know what you think. If you've read this or if you just watched and have any ideas or thoughts to contribute, let me know in the comments. And next week we'll also be in chapter 2, but we'll be talking about the first vision.